Hello everyone, welcome back to Whole Wellness. My name is Anne. In today's video, we're talking about something that is very close to my heart. It has to do with my dad. So recently I've noticed in the last couple of days specifically what I'll simply call an unsettled feeling in my heart and in my soul with regards to my dad's passing in January. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Then last night I couldn't sleep and I found myself puzzling with great frustration about why I had recorded the content for this video 4 times and wound up deleting it, because every time I recorded it and then went back to edit the video, within the first few minutes of editing, I was disgusted with how the video turned out. And I felt that I sounded rambling and very scatterbrained in the video and not really succinct and well thought out. So I wound up deleting it and re-recording it. And I did that 4 times. And so as I lay there in the dark last night trying to figure out why I couldn't sleep, and then believing that I was being productive by trying to organize my thoughts to record this video, hopefully successfully, a 5th time, it hit me. I am very angry at my dad again, angry and hurt. I had discovered and processed so much anger and hurt that I held for my dad over the last year or two, feelings that stemmed from my upbringing as I received therapy and began opening myself up and being willing to heal and grow. And I was fortunate enough to have found peace and acceptance about who my dad was as a person, with his own injuries, with his own faults and weaknesses in the months leading up to his death. I had reached this point where I'd come to terms with the fact that in this lifetime, my dad was not going to change, that there was nothing I could do about who he was. And I spent the time that I needed grieving the father that I never had prior to him actually dying. I realized I had spent many years wishing and yearning for something that I would never have. An intimate and emotional connection with a father who knew me as a person and who loved me unconditionally. And just prior to my dad dying, I was very blessed to realize very unexpectedly that I had forgiven him and released him from having any further control over my mental and emotional status or mental or emotional health. And so I haven't felt hurt or anger towards my dad in many months. It felt foreign to me to be experiencing it again recently, and so I wasn't quick to recognize it. So why am I hurt and why am I angry all over again at my dad? Because even though he was aware that he was dying and had been aware for months, he left this earth never imparting any final words of wisdom for me or my children for the future. Never saying goodbye. He left this earth without giving me any words of comfort. He knew the end was near. He was of sound mind in his final moments and hours and days of his life, but left this world with nothing further to say to me or gift me, verbally or non-verbally. In my dad's defense, let me interject here though, that a few days before he died, he did verbally say to me that he loved me. I was holding his hand. But what is love really? I've been pondering that quite a bit over the last couple of years as I've gotten healthier and healthier. Love tends to be just a word we throw around without really thinking too much about it. And it's such a deep word. It's not just a word though. It's not something you just say. It's a conviction, it's a belief, and it's action. Truly, anyone who's been the victim of abuse knows this deep down inside. It's not enough to say I love you if the person saying I love you is mistreating and disrespecting you. It's not enough to say I love you if the person who's saying I love you does not speak kindly to you or speak words of compassion towards you. It's not enough to say I love you if the person saying I love you is not speaking words of comfort, support, and encouragement. It's just not enough to say the words. Love is a conscious choice that we make to act and to speak in love with others and with love. The last communication I had with my dad in the hospital before he died was the nonverbal thumbs up he gave my sister and I as we rubbed lotion on his feet. And I remember immediately feeling joy about this little communication when he did this, that I was able to make him happy in his final hours. And I still do. Is it something that's actually going to occur to us while our loved one is laying in front of us dying? That they just gave us a tiny snippet of something that we've so desperately longed for our entire lives? Validation? No. But it sure does hurt when all of a sudden you realize that the joy you're feeling is rooted in that validation you just received. Of course, it felt good to do something kind for an old man who was dying. I would be honored and glad to help ease another human's suffering. But it really pains me to admit that that really wasn't wholly the source of my joy in those first few moments after my dad gave the thumbs up. And what's worse is there are several other unhealthy aspects of who my dad was and what he did and didn't say while he was in the hospital that have begun to haunt me over the last couple of days. In the briefest way possible, because there is some background that I do have to share with you in order for you to understand where I'm coming from, I'll share with you what I mean by that statement. What I experienced with my dad in the final phase of his life is why I'm hurt and angry with him all over again. I want to mention here, though, that that's one thing that time and space and peace of mind and clarity and healing will bring to you, though, is that understanding of what you might have been overloaded with mentally and or emotionally in the moment, that once you get time and space and peace of mind, you're able to understand and get clarity about. So here's a little bit of the backstory. My dad was hospitalized for over 3 weeks in July of 2022. At that time, my family and I definitely thought we were going to lose him. The medical team wanted him on dialysis, and even though he refused dialysis at first, he was considering it, I believe, by the time he was released. His being released, though, last July came as an utter surprise to me. I was shocked. And within less than 2 months, my sister-in-law had moved in with my dad because he had an extra bedroom to help him out. Then in January of 2023, my dad was readmitted to the hospital again, and he was declining the entire time he was in the hospital. The doctors, on the Friday before he passed on a Thursday. On the Friday before he passed, had told my family, a couple of my siblings, that my dad's organs were failing. His heart, his lungs, and kidneys were all competing for treatment and care. And my dad was also fighting a staph infection in both of his legs. I visited my dad as often as I could in the hospital, and every time I went to the hospital, he wanted answers. And I actually have a note in one of my notebooks that I carry in my purse, where in scribbled handwriting one time when he had a machine hooked up to, like a CPAP machine or something hooked up, he scribbled a note, and I couldn't read it at first, and he wrote it again, and it says, "Get me answers." And every time I look at that note, I'm going to keep that note forever. It just breaks my heart because all of this stuff comes back to me. But he was always inquiring about the status of his health while he was in the hospital. He seemed to be very convinced that what they were telling him just couldn't possibly be true. It wasn't the case. There had to be something else going on, or it's almost like he was there. He was of sound mind and he was sharp, but it's almost like he rejected it. We could tell him everything we knew and he still demanded answers. It's almost like it just wasn't good enough. But aside from asking what the status of his health was and when he was getting out of the hospital, he didn't have much to say. He congratulated me on my new job when he found out about it and asked how it was, but I didn't want to talk about my job. As you guys know, if you're familiar with some of my other content, my dad has always equated his kids' value and worth, or at least this is what he implied. This is the feeling I have always gotten from him, that our worth and our value as humans were directly tied to our job titles, our salaries, and our standing within our communities. So the last year or two, the healthier I got, the less I wanted to talk about work with my dad. As you can imagine, we had very little to talk about as a result. Though I did try on numerous occasions to tell him about what I was working on with my art projects and the studio that I had converted last fall with the help of my husband and my kids. But my dad never seemed to be interested in that. He never asked me about it from one visit to the next. He never, if I told him about the studio, he wouldn't say, like, what kind of art desk did you get? What kind of lighting? What are you doing in there? What kind of layout are you having? And why did you do that? Or there were no questions. There was just no interest in it. So the Friday night before my dad died, my sister-in-law had left the hospital to take a break. She had been in the hospital for a couple hours that afternoon. And my sister and I, who were just arriving earlier in the evening, were there for her to relay the message to us that someone should have a talk with dad because he wants to know when he's getting out of the hospital. And it made her very uncomfortable to know the answers to these questions that my dad was asking, but not really have the responsibility to tell him. And I could understand that. The doctors were all saying up that week and that day that the outlook of my dad being discharged from the hospital was very grim and that his organs were failing him. And my sister, in that conversation, as my sister-in-law was leaving and I was walking in with my sister told my sister-in-law and I that she would talk to my dad that night. And I wholeheartedly supported that because as my dad's medical authority representative, my dad needed to hear it from my sister, the truth about what was going on. And I was surprised, honestly, by that point that no one had had that conversation with him yet. But in the moment when my sister said that she would have the conversation with him, I was like, whatever, the past is in the past, at least she's going to do it now. And I felt good and I supported it. So my sister and I were visiting with my dad for quite a while, maybe an hour or so, and we had small talk and there were a few breaks and some silence, and there were a couple of times where I thought, when is she going to tell him? There's all these openings in the conversation. My dad's not jibber jabbering, we've had some quiet moments. He's asked some questions. Now would be an ideal time. That happened a couple of times and I kept wondering, when is she going to tell him? Visiting hours are almost over. My sister was being very vague when she would respond to his answers, like, yeah, the doctors are trying to do better and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and I know you're frustrated, but she wasn't actually just spitting it out and telling him black and white, your organs are failing you and you're probably not getting out of the hospital. I spent a quiet moment pondering whether I should step up and do what my sister was unable or unwilling to do. And I decided that the fear that I had that she would be angry with me for speaking up when she was supposed to be the one speaking up was worth the risk. I didn't care if she got mad at me. My dad deserved to know the truth about what was going on and the status of his health and the outlook of him going home. And so I told him the next time he asked, or alluded to, he doesn't understand what's going on, I looked him in the eye and I said, your organs are failing, your kidneys, your lungs, and your heart. And the doctors don't see how you're going to be able to be released from the hospital this time. But they are working very hard to figure out how to get you home. And I was pretty stunned and hurt when I finished and my dad looked at me with daggers in his eyes. Now looking back on that, perhaps that's why my sister didn't speak up, because she knew that that's how he was going to react, She just never had a chance to tell me, hey, by the way, I don't intend to tell Dad. Maybe just in the moment she froze. I don't know. My sister's the lost child, and I don't know a whole lot about the lost child role in the family. So I've got to do more studying and more research. But regardless, in the moment, in my quiet moment, as I was pondering, someone needs to speak up, and my sister and I are the only ones there, I decided my dad deserved to hear the truth, and I told him that. And when he reacted that way, I was hurt. And because I could feel his anger at me, directed towards me, even though all I had done was a favor for him, answered his question about what the status of his health was. But I didn't even really get a chance to respond. I was still processing the look that he was giving me. He looked down for several seconds, but then when he looked back up at me with the dagger still in his eyes, he said to me, well, that's a kick to the teeth. And all I could think to say was, yeah, it is. And I looked at my sister for kind of like to gauge how she was handling the fact that I just told my dad what he needed to hear and his reaction. And she was just kind of nodding and smiling and looking at me like, yeah. But she didn't say anything. She just kind of sat there like, yep. I shouldn't say she was nodding and smiling, but she just kind of sat there like this, like nodding her head with this raised eyebrows, like, yeah, what Anne's saying is true, but I don't want to be the one to verbally confirm that, yeah, that's the truth, because I don't want the daggers directed towards me. The scapegoat is responsible for taking all the daggers. And I had to bite my tongue for several seconds, because what I felt inside in that moment when my dad was daggerized at me, I felt like shouting at him, why are you so shocked? Why are you so upset? I told you 6 months ago that your kidneys were failing. The doctors told you needed to be on dialysis if you were going to live. There's fluid on your lungs. Your heart has issues. None of this should be a surprise to you. That's what I felt like shouting to him, but I bit my tongue. And 15 minutes later, my sister and I had to leave. I visited him again. That was the Friday before he died. I visited him again on Saturday afternoon for a couple hours. And then Saturday night was when the medical team had to do the emergency intubation. Sunday, my siblings and I gathered to have a in-person conference and on the phone conference for those who aren't local to discuss the status of my dad, the emergency intubation, and the next medical steps. And my sister had the medical authority. We were all on the same page. We understood everything. Monday and Tuesday, the medical team had attempted to remove the tube from my dad, and they didn't have any success. And Wednesday, on my lunch break from work, I scooted over to the hospital to visit, and my sister-in-law was in there with him, and that's when she came out and she was going, he just went like this, he just went like this. And she was all in a panic because the movement he made seemed to her to be like a final kind of a movement to be making. And the moment she told me about it, I was like, he's telling us he's done. So I immediately got on the phone with my sister and told her what my sister-in-law had experienced, what my dad had signaled, and that I had attempted to do non-verbal communication with him with the hand squeezing as I was asking him questions right up against his ear because he had his hearing aids out and he had a hard time hearing. But he's on the ventilator, his eyes are closed, and I was basically shouting into his ear, and he was squeezing yes and no to my hand. I would say, squeeze my hand if you want us to take the ventilator out, and he would squeeze my hand. And I would say, squeeze my hand if you want them to leave the ventilator in, and he wouldn't squeeze my hand. And I said, squeeze my hand if you're ready to see your parents in heaven, and he squeezed my hand. And I did that even after I hung up with my sister. I did that several more times just to be sure, and I had my sister-in-law, who was still there, witness that so we could be sure. So my sister got on the phone with the doctor and gave them the directive to remove the ventilator. And then we started texts and phone calls to the rest of our siblings to let them know that we anticipated Dad to be passing very shortly, very soon. And my sister arrived within like 15 minutes or something like that, right before they removed the tube. And about 20 minutes after they removed the tube, my dad was able to speak in a very, very raspy, hoarse voice. Don't ever do that to me again. And then he said that was the single worst experience of his life. Those were the first things he said to us, my sister and I. My sister and I both recollected later that we felt horrible, and I certainly felt the sting of guilt in those moments when my dad spoke those words to us, as though we had made the decision to intubate him and he wasn't even aware what had happened or how he got intubated in the first place. So he didn't know that we weren't even involved in that decision, that it happened overnight on a Saturday night, and that they had tried to remove the tube without success. We wound up trying to explain to him that the medical staff thought he had developed pneumonia and thought they would be able to remove the ventilator, but he stopped breathing, and that's why they put the ventilator in on Saturday night until they could confirm with the family what the next steps were. And their hope was that after he got on the medication for pneumonia, that he would be able to be removed from the ventilator as the fluid drained from his lungs. But that never happened. My dad didn't pass as quickly as we thought he would after the ventilator was removed. And that afternoon, he was able to say a few things, small talk wise, in a very raspy voice throughout the afternoon, requesting like a sponge to get moisture in his throat, to ease the irritation in there from the tube, and to adjust his pillows in his bed and things like that. Other than that, it was a very quiet and subdued evening. But later in the evening, as it got to be bedtime, 9 o'clock or whatever, he started having difficulty breathing again, especially as he was reclining in his bed. And the medical staff asked him if he would like to be hooked up to a BiPAP machine, and he said yes. So once my dad was hooked up to the BiPAP machine, it's like a CPAP, and my dad couldn't talk to us anymore. And he died the next morning. So that is the synopsis of the things that transpired verbally and non-verbally with my dad and the hours and days leading up to my dad's death. Now, given his 3-week hospitalization last July, the talk of dialysis back then, the fact that he was re-hospitalized for several days prior to these events taking place, and the fact that my dad was 77 years old, I would think that it's pretty clear to the average, intelligent, sound-minded individual that my dad was nearing the end of his life, so to speak, that he had entered the final phase of his life. I don't think anyone could really disagree with that statement. It's a rational, reasonable thought. But despite all of this, he still was asking when he was going home and what the status of his health was Friday night before he died. And that's part of what I'm angry about, because my dad didn't seem to accept the reality of the situation. Yet he was of sound mind. Now, I at least feel fortunate enough that I was able to personally tell him about the status of his health so that I would know that he knew that he was dying, that we communicated it to him. I do feel that he understood it to some extent, or he wouldn't have said, "That's a kick to the teeth." But here is what has really plagued me with anger and hurt the last couple of days. Number one, my dad's last verbal words to me and my sister were to shame us for something we had no control over, the ventilator. No thank you for doing the nonverbal communication with it to get it removed. No expression of relief or comfort after having it removed. No words of understanding how difficult our position must be. Nothing at all like what I would imagine a healthy parent might say to his or her adult children after events like that. And the second thing that has plagued me the last few days is that my dad never took the opportunity, when he had the opportunity available to him to utter any final words of wisdom to me or my sister. Words for me to keep with me and to cherish after he had gone. No goodbye, just died. He had the opportunity to say anything to me before he passed, but he didn't. I imagine a healthy parent, at least I would as a parent, have loads of words of wisdom to share with my children if I was given an opportunity to do so before I died. Not the least of which would probably be, don't grieve long for me. I'm going to a better place. Parents are supposed to die before their kids. That's the way it's supposed to be. I'm good. I love you. I'll see you again. Enjoy this life. It's beautiful. Sorry, I almost got teary-eyed there. No, my dad left this world in the same way he lived in this world. Stubborn, bitter, and angry, and blaming others for his disappointments and setbacks. And so now I am committed to deal with and process and work through the anger and the hurt that has resurfaced within me that is so profound because of this recent clarity and understanding about the final days of my dad's life and how he left this world, so that I don't inadvertently pass my hurt and my anger onto my children and my spouse, which is exactly how generational trauma perpetuates. Thanks for tuning in, guys. See you next time.